A couple of weeks ago, I was driving around the Highway 270, that circles the St. Louis area, listening to arguments on talk radio about politics and the economy. And I had another one of those experiences I get every once in a while where I just got really disgusted at all the rhetoric. And I came to this rather marvelous insight, I thought. I decided from now on I would only listen to poor Republicans and rich Democrats, because they were the ones who, at least when it comes to economics, were not voting for themselves and their own bank accounts and their own economic advantage. Now, obviously, this is a little exaggerated, yet I still thought it was a pretty cool insight. But still, it seems to me that it's true that if they are poor Democrats or rich Republicans, it's quite possible they're voting to make themselves richer and fighting for their own wealth, which is where I hear so much anxiety in this country these days, even among the most wealthy. I'd like to ask you to do a show of hands for a second. But before you raise your hand, I want to ask you the question, ask you to think about it. The question is, did Jesus spend time with the poor? If you agree that Jesus spent time with the poor, raise your hand. Wow, look around you at all the hands up here. You know, studies say that when that question is asked of groups of Christians, some 80% raise their hand, say, oh, for sure, Jesus spent time with the poor. So I have a next question. But this time I don't want you to raise your hand on the outside of you. But if it's true, I want you to raise it on the inside of you. So don't raise your hand. It might incriminate you. Just think about it. Do you spend time with the poor? When that question is asked of groups of quick Christians, less than 2%, less than 2% say that they do. 80% say Jesus did. Less than 2% say they do. There's a powerful lesson here, I believe. And it seems to be this. We can admire and we can worship Jesus without doing what Jesus did. We can applaud what he preached and what he stood for without caring about the very same things he preached and stood for. We can adore his cross without ever taking up our own. The great tragedy of the churches is not that rich Christians do not care about the poor, but that rich Christians do not know the poor. They don't know them. That collision, the collision that would come about if the poor and the rich ever met, that collision would result in a fusion that would change the world. But that collision rarely happens. When will the slums of Calcutta meet the beautiful edifices of Washington University? When will the homeless meet the people who live in homes that are half empty? When the poor meet the rich, riches will lose their power. And when the rich meet the poor, poverty will come to an end. No matter our politics, we cannot forget Lazarus at the doorsteps of our own mansions. Don't just give to the poor, Jesus is saying. See them. See them. You and I have managed to develop a culture in which we look at people. We look at people. We look at hot girls. We look at beggars. We look at the rich and the famous. We look at people in their fancy suits or people in their dreads. We've developed a culture in which we look at people, but we seldom look into people, We seldom get into their stories and into their lives where God lives. Dorothy Day founded a movement called the Catholic Worker Movement. It's in most cities in this country, most big cities in this country, and it's a group of people who live with the poor and work with the poor day in and day out. And she wrote, "The true atheist is the one who refuses to see God's image in the face of the neighbor." If that is true, we are so atheist. But if we look, if we take the time and maybe even the courage to look, what we will see in their face is our own. And we will see that we're the same. And what's more, in their face, we will see the face of God. But the problem is that the rich and the poor are kept in separate worlds. Inequality is carefully managed, but not dismantled. Had the rich man let his eyes rest on that poor man, that man who was poor, he might have seen a brother. And he might have seen Jesus in a way he never had before. And it might have convinced him even more than seeing someone rise from the dead. I believe it was Vincent de Paul who said once, when a young man came to him, riddled, tormented with doubts about whether or not there's a God, he said, "Put down your books, go into the streets, and love the poor, and you will find faith." Go love the poor, and you'll find faith. It might have convinced the rich man to have just seen that man at his doorstep than even seeing someone rise from the dead. True compassion, my friends, is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. True compassion comes to see that a system that produces beggars needs to be repaved. Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa. She let herself see Lazarus at her door. And then she left everything to serve him. Mother Teresa said that Calcuttas are everywhere if we only have eyes to see. Find your own Calcutta, she said. God's economy is so different than our own. The story of Lazarus and the rich man proclaimed here tonight is about bridging this gap that seems to be getting wider and wider all the time, especially in our country. It's about letting ourselves see the other, see the poor, the human beings that are poor. One of the signs of Pentecost is that there were no needy among them. They saw that figuring out a way of redistributing wealth was essential. Glenn, back aside. Redistribution of wealth is something they sort of understood. They got. That this wasn't somehow a bad word that somehow said we were becoming socialistic or something. This was somehow something about the way Jesus lived. Look again at that story if you don't believe me. Or even more, look at what Jesus did and what Jesus said while he was among us. What changed? My friends, what changed from those days? Jesus never says to the poor, "Come, find the church." Jesus says to the church, "Go into the world and find the poor." So many things preoccupy us in our communities, all the communities we're a part of. I was in 4 parishes before I came here, and this is true of every single one of them, including here, the CSC. When you listen to the things that upset people about their churches, their parishes, their communities of faith, when you listen to what really upsets them, what occupies their attention, what people talk about obsessively, is always about their needs not being met. Somebody ignoring them or not paying enough attention to them or somebody who hurt their feelings. It was always about me, my needs not being met, my frustrations, my upsetness with this church or this community or this pastor. But when was the last time you ever heard anybody ask, ever in any parish, anywhere, where are the poor? Where are the poor here? Where are they? Are the poor among us? If the rich don't know the poor, the rich lose. Wealthy countries like ours have the highest rates of depression and suicide and loneliness in the world. Yet we are the richest. And yet we are the most miserable people in the world. With this gap as great as it is, we just can't keep thinking like we always have. It's not working. It's not working for the poor, and it's not working for us. Gandhi was asked periodically if he was a Christian. And you know what he would reply? He'd say, ask the poor. Ask the poor. They'll tell you who the Christians are. I was up really late the other night, Thursday night, trying my best to multitask. I was writing this homily, and I was also writing references for some of you, some of the students in our community. It was getting on to 5 in the morning. It's even later than I usually stay up. And I was having trouble falling back asleep, and let me tell you why. And it was this juxtaposition of these two things, like references and this gospel. It's because I got to wondering, if I can I even get to heaven without a letter of recommendation from the poor? Would any poor person ever write a recommendation about me to God? I got to wondering if there'd even be one. No matter what party we vote with, whether we happen to be rich Republicans or poor Democrats, the truth is that what we let ourselves see and the choices that leads to can nudge this world to better. And they can nudge us to better. And we might just feel more alive than we've ever been. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally God and the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, God not made, one in being with the Father. Through him all things are made. For our sin and for our salvation, he came down from heaven. By the power of the Holy Spirit, he was born of the Virgin Mary and became man. For our sake, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered, died, and was buried. And on the third day, he rose again in fulfillment of the Scriptures.